G'day mate, 40 here, and every time I try to sit down to broadcast some simple truths, the regime sends waves coming after me. All I'm going to do is share my feelings and tell my story, but they're trying to shut me down, guys. So, listening to an excellent New Yorker article, A Dangerous Game Over Taiwan. It's written by Dexter Filkins, who wrote a book on the Iraq invasion, a thing called the Forever War. And he gave me an interview for lukewarm.net about 20 years ago. He's also a friend of, or an acquaintance of Yoshi Obayashi, a stand-up comic who's appeared on my show several times. So here's a good little bit on this, excerpt from this.
In 2013, Chinese construction crews arrived at a shoal in the South China Sea known as Mischief Reef. It was a speck in the ocean, so shallow that at high tide it disappeared below the water. But that didn't last.
Okay, Mischief Reef. So let's say there's a dispute between the United States and China over Mischief Reef, or a dispute between any two nations. How powerful is international law? How effective is international law going to be at resolving these disputes? And international law is only as effective as the nations that agree to enforce it, right? International law in and of itself doesn't command any armies. So US and China have a conflict over Mischief Reef, and is international law going to solve that? What if China's violating international law? God forbid. Right, we're all locked in an iron cage together, and no one's coming to rescue us.
The Chinese crews began piling sand atop the reef, and eventually poured acres of concrete to build it into an island, attempting to create a new political entity in one of the world's busiest shipping corridors, on the southern approach to Taiwan. Mischief Reef was also claimed by the Philippines, which sued China in the International Court of Arbitration. But the Chinese crews carried on, even firing water cannons.
Whoa! So the Chinese crews carried on, even firing water cannon, guys. Water cannon, that's how serious it got. So you think this could just be resolved by going to the World Court, right? The Philippines sued China. Let me give you some guesses how this is going to work out. So Robert Wright, right, who does that weekly show with Mickey Kaus, author of many books, right, he wants the US to be more observant of international law, and then hopes that will have an effect on other nations, that maybe if the US observes international law, that when the US condemns other nations for violating international law, maybe that'll have more effect. Well, it may have more rhetorical effect, but it's not really going to change facts on the ground. Fact is, we're all locked in an iron cage together. No one is coming to rescue us, and there's no international arbitrator who has the force of armies behind him, unless particular armies decide to give him that power. Right, Philippines sues China, goes to the World Court. How's this going to work out?
Ends at Filipino boats sailing to a nearby reef. Within a few years, they had built a runway and brought in radar and anti-aircraft missiles, along with troops to man them. Over time, 2 more artificial islands were fully militarized.
Okay, that sounds very naughty. China's been very naughty, creating artificial islands in the South China Sea. And so do you think international law is going to deter them? No, the only thing that's going to deter them is overwhelming economic or military force. Circumstances. Now, different nations may join together and use the pretext of China's violations of international law to take action. But then international law is just going to be a pretext. It's not going to be the determining factor. How do you think this is going to work out?
The construction was part of a long-running effort to claim jurisdiction in the South China Sea, which...
So who do you think gets to effectively claim jurisdiction in the South China Sea? Right? I'll give you a guess. It's going to be the entity that is able to enforce its jurisdiction. Right? Does Israel have a right to exist? Nobody has a right to exist. You have to seize and defend your right to exist. Otherwise, there's no inherent right to exist. USA, USA, right? If the US is stronger, then it will get its way. If China is stronger, then China will get its way. International law won't really shape this dispute. Now, let me know if the wind becomes like way too obnoxious. Going back to this New Yorker article, A Dangerous Game Over Taiwan.
Which is rich in fishing beds and oil deposits. For decades, China's government has been declaring that tiny spits of land in the sea are in fact islands, entitled to territorial waters that extend out for miles. The Chinese have made more than 200 such claims, giving them jurisdiction over international waters and making it increasingly difficult for other nations to operate. In 2016, the International Court of Arbitration ruled that the claims had no validity. The Chinese government ignored the ruling, which the vice foreign minister dismissed as...
Okay, so China's just dismissing these international rules. Very sad. All right, China's not being real respectful of international law here. So I'm going to try to shelter my cheap Oppo phone away from the wind so that we can have a comfy and cozy, intimate discussion here about the power of international law. So if China establishes facts on the ground, then it's only going to be other facts that have greater force than China's facts that would determine what's going to happen in the South China Sea and in life in general. Right? You just can't rely upon the law unless you know who's going to enforce the law. Right? There are also laws that the Black Lives Matter protests violated, and they largely got away with it because they were doing their demonstrations in Democratic Party controlled jurisdictions. And so the laws on the books didn't really matter because they depended upon individuals to enforce them. That's why there could never be purely neutral law, because all law requires individuals to enforce it.
A scrap of paper. On September 1st, 2021,
International law.
China declared that any foreign vessel sailing in the territorial waters of the reclaimed reefs and shoals would be required to identify itself.
So many men say, oh, marriage is just a scrap of paper. Well, it's a scrap of paper and carries with it communal sanction. So if the community doesn't enforce the sacred or special status of marriage, then that scrap of paper by itself is not going to enforce anything. All right, so just a scrap of paper on its own, whether it's international law or a marriage document, in and of itself is not going to enforce anything. It depends upon a community sanction. It depends upon people putting effort and power and sanction behind the paper.
The U.S. refused. As a former senior naval officer told me, we made it absolutely clear that we weren't going to abide by that. A week later, an American destroyer called the USS Benfold sailed past Mischief Reef without providing identification. Chinese forces went on high alert, and the People's Liberation Army declared the ship's presence the latest ironclad proof of attempted U.S. hegemony and militarization of the South China.
So China created facts on the ground, then dictated how everyone else was to conduct themselves, and the United States just ignored China's directions. And because the United States is in a more powerful economic and military position, they can afford to ignore China's directions.
The sea. The U.S. Navy said that the mission was intended to demonstrate that the United States will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. As China stepped up its claims in the Pacific, Western leaders responded. In September of 2021 alone, the U.S. Navy sent aircraft carriers, destroyers, and other warships into the waters around Taiwan or the South China Sea at least 6 times. The British, at least twice. The next month, ships from the U.S., the U.
So as the individual becomes more aggressive, and as China becomes more aggressive, or any group becomes more aggressive, right? There are always reactions. So this is first stage thinking, to think that you can just establish facts on the ground and there won't be any reaction. So a lot of like liberal left public policies are based on this type of thinking, stage one thinking, that okay, now we're going to increase marginal tax rates, say from 25% to 75%, and then we'll bring in 3 times as much money. But it doesn't work that way, right? People respond to incentives. First stage, you increase marginal tax rates. Second stage, people react to those incentives and adjust themselves accordingly. So you become aggressive like China, other nations are increasingly incentivized to band together to oppose you. And that's what's happening.
UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Japan gathered in the Philippine Sea for a sprawling multinational naval exercise, one of the largest since the end of the Cold War.
So China has almost no allies. China is surrounded by countries that loathe it. The United States has very powerful alliances. So having an alliance often comes with a price. Right? Alliances are not cost-free. Human connections come with a price. Right? To bond with people, it always produces an ethic. You have to, modify yourself, your behavior, restrict yourself if you're going to maintain relationships. But if you can maintain bonds with other people, you're going to be in a much more powerful position at work, in your love life, in your personal life, in your international life. So China has virtually no allies who count. The United States has very strong alliances.
This year, the U.S. has sent warships into the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea 17 times and has routinely sent aircraft to patrol there. The naval activity has sometimes been so intense that each side appeared to be reacting to the other. A former senior American naval officer insisted that this wasn't the case, as the Navy planned each mission weeks in advance. "I think they are reacting to us," he said.
Okay, we're always reacting to each other, but it's the stronger party who dominates interaction. So the higher you are in status, the less likely you are to pay attention to the behaviors and words of people lower in status. The stronger your country or your business, the less you have to pay attention to the actions of other parties. Now, the Biden administration, with regard to Ukraine, only wanted to give them defensive weapons, but that doesn't really matter very much, right? Defensive weapons still count as weapons because it means you're more protected, which means the offensive party, which in this case is Russia, has to go to greater lengths to overcome you. So whether the US arms Ukraine with purely defensive or even offensive weapons, it doesn't really matter that much, right? If the United States had never armed Ukraine with any weapons, Russia would likely have never invaded. If NATO had not made Ukraine a de facto member of NATO, right, Russia would never have needed to invade. So many of these shibboleths, many of these tropes that you hear all the time in the news media, they're just nonsense.
Whenever Americans have appeared, a Chinese vessel or aircraft has invariably come to shadow them. Occasionally, the encounters have been humorous. In 2015, a U.S. Navy reconnaissance plane was patrolling the South China Sea when it received a radio message. "This is the Chinese Navy," a voice said in heavily accented English. "Please go away quickly in order to wrong judgment." An American officer gave a carefully parsed response. "I am a United States military aircraft, conducting lawful military activities outside national airspace." The voice over the radio replied, "Meow." It was followed by a...
G'day, mate. Got a lively bunch in the chat here. So, one advantage that the United States has is that we speak English here. So English is now the international language. So when you hear Chinese speakers of English, right, who are not native to the English language, like, it's really stilted and awkward. If you don't learn a language by the time you're about 7 or 8, 9, 10, 11 at the oldest, right, you'll always sound very awkward and stilted. So it helps that the United States speaks English. English is the language of the powerful. It's the dominant language in the world. Now, on the other hand, They don't want every other nation to speak English because every form of language carries with it, the possibility of the transmittal of, defective or dangerous ideas. Right? You can only really maintain your own culture if you maintain your language. Yeah, English is the lingua franca. It's the language of the internet. It's the language of the rich and the powerful. And it gives the United States a big advantage over places like China and Japan.
Series of mysterious beeps. The sound of space invaders. The 1970s video game. In 2020, the Chinese military issued a harsher provocation. A propaganda video in which nuclear-capable H-6K jets carried out simulated missile attacks.
So propaganda is a form of soft power. And soft power doesn't really count for much. Right? What dominates the world is hard power. Right? You can have all the soft power you want, but in the end, the world is run by hard power. Hard power is economic power. Hard power is military power. It's the hard power that dominates. Right? The United States is not going to be frightened by Chinese propaganda videos. We're outside the Crown Royal Casino here in Sydney. We're just south of Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Opera House. So China can come forward with all this propaganda videos. Right? Doesn't really matter much, and we can do Voice of America. We can beam that into China, but that's not going to change the fundamental dynamics of power. And it's going to come down to hard power. Now, if you're a spiritual person, you've got the teachings of the Bible, where it says, not by might, not by power, but by, thy will, O Lord. So that's a useful technique for people who are kind of discouraged by the real world.
In the video, which the PLA titled, "The God of War H-6K Goes on the Attack," the warplanes strike what appears to be Guam, the home of Andersen Air Force Base, one of a handful of major U.S. bases in the Pacific.
So if the US and China go to war over Taiwan, China will probably hit US military bases in Guam, also US military bases in Japan and in San Diego and in Darwin, Australia. So the United States has been pouring more resources into Australia, part of its pivot to the Pacific. We've got more Marines, the United States has more Marines in Darwin. We've got more resources in Darwin. So Australia very likely to get hit if the US and China go to war over Taiwan. One of the prices of partnership and alliances.
The ground erupts. A block of waterfront warehouses bursts into a fireball, and then a column of smoke rises toward the planes. American observers responded bluffly to the simulation. "We could have killed them 6 times," a U.S. military officer told me. Still, China's belligerence reflected how the balance of military power had shifted since the late 90s, when the two...
So you never really know what happens when you go to war. So you maybe feel very confident that you can kill them 6 times, but war always brings with it some nasty surprises. Also, in a battle over Taiwan, Taiwan's right next door to China. Right? It's thousands and thousands of miles away from the United States. So it's a lot easier to fight when you're at home rather than abroad. So was that great 19th century military strategist? Clausewitz. Clausewitz said you need 3 times as many forces to successfully invade at a minimum as opposed to defend.
2 countries got into a dispute over Taiwan, and China was forced to give way. It began in 1995, when President Lee Teng-hui sought a visa to the U.S. to deliver a speech at Cornell.
So why was China forced to give way? Because it was weaker militarily and economically. So this is how the world works. The strong take what they want, the weak endure what they must. So that's why I think it's better to be strong than to be weak.
The Clinton administration at first refused, but after an uproar in Congress, it agreed to grant him one. The Chinese leader, enraged by what he regarded as Lee's show of independence, missile tests near the island and instructed the PLA to stage military exercises, one of which mimicked an amphibious assault. President Clinton responded by sending a Marine landing ship and 2 other warships into the Taiwan Strait, followed a week later.
Right. Why would anyone not want to see China contained? All right. I don't see how an ever-growing stronger China is good for anyone with whom I can identify. I mean, anyone I know. Like, I can understand why China wants to get stronger, but I don't see how that's good for anyone else, including Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Australia, Philippines, United States. I don't see how any of these nations are better off with a stronger China.
By an aircraft carrier. Jiang backed down, but the crisis wasn't over. The next March, after Lee declared his intention to enter Taiwan's first free presidential election, Jiang ordered new missile tests, along with...
So when it comes to war, it doesn't really matter much if your opponent is a democracy or a dictatorship, right? Democracies do not wage war in any more humane fashion than dictatorships. To the extent there is evidence that they're even less humane, because you usually are dealing with an aroused populace who feels righteous about venting all their might on evil. So with a democracy that goes to war, it's going to be sold in terms of good versus evil, which is exactly what we have in the war over Ukraine, right? It's being sold to us by the media and by our elites as good versus evil. Therefore, there's a lot less room to compromise when you've moralized the conflict. That's why democracies are even more likely to be absolutely brutal in waging war than authoritarian and dictatorial regimes. But if you're going up against a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime, right, it doesn't really matter, right? You're not more or less likely to win. Right, your opponent is not more or less likely to be formidable if they're a dictatorship or a democracy. And the spread of democracy does not reduce conflict in the world. Right, there's little evidence of that. So I'm just trying to have a peaceful show here, and the liberal hegemonists keep sending these waves to interrupt my flow, man.
With further exercises. This time, Clinton responded with even greater force, sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups into the waters near Taiwan. Amid the crisis, thousands of Taiwanese requested visas to flee the island, and the stock market plummeted. But Jiang backed down again.
So that was a major reason why Zelensky, the head of Ukraine, didn't want to more aggressively prepare for a Russian invasion, because he would tank the stock market. So it's not just Donald Trump who has a preoccupation with the stock market. So too Great Britain in World War II. All right, if they'd prepared more aggressively, spent more money preparing, they would have crashed their economy. So Great Britain prepared just about as well as they possibly could have for World War II, because you don't want to do gratuitous harm for your economy, because your economy powers your military. You can't just trash your economy to further your military. You have to weigh up both of these goods. You want to maintain, an elite economy along with an elite military, because if you crash the economy, right, your military is going to suffer. So Great Britain in 1937, 38, 39 started preparing for war with Germany, right? Prime Minister Chamberlain waved a piece of paper saying, peace in our time, but he didn't stop preparing for war. He did absolutely everything he could to prepare for war. There's a good argument that by reaching temporary accommodations with Hitler, that Great Britain got to be more prepared for war in 1939. That Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, delayed the onset of war for about a year, which may well have been more in Great Britain's interests than in Germany's interests. And so Chamberlain and Great Britain were doing everything they could to prepare for war with Germany, even though they had this piece of paper and you wave it and you say, oh, we've got peace in our time. Yeah, they had peace in our time, but they were preparing for war. And Zelensky didn't want to talk about a war with Russia, afraid that that would provoke his powerful neighbor. But he had very smart people in his armed forces doing absolutely everything they could to prepare for war with Russia, and they wouldn't even tell the United States what their plans were. Right? They kept it hidden. They kept their war plans hidden in all likelihood from both Zelensky, the prime minister, from the United States, from other countries, from the parliament. Right? They kept their plans hidden, and the number one plan was they were willing to surrender territory and then hope that Russia would outstrip its logistics, and then they'd be able to pick off the Russians, which is exactly what they did, and it turned out to be very effective.
The Chinese were humiliated, a former senior official in the Clinton administration told me. They vowed never again. Since then, China has undertaken an ambitious military buildup that has brought its conventional forces to near parity with the United States.
So there's actually very little difference in Churchill's attitudes towards the Nazis and Chamberlain's. Like during the 1930s, they were about on the same page. Okay, so for tactical reasons, Chamberlain flew to Europe and reached an accommodation with Hitler and gave up Czechoslovakia, right, and waved a piece of paper saying we have peace in our time. But in terms of the policies they supported and the rhetoric that they used to describe Nazi Germany, there's virtually no difference between Chamberlain and Winston Churchill. And yeah, for a time, Churchill wanted to use Hitler to eliminate Soviet Union, but once, it all depends on situation, right? Once Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, then Soviet Union became the dearest friend. Churchill said, like, I'd make a deal with the devil to, fight against our biggest enemy at the time, which was Germany. So no permanent friends, no permanent allies, no permanent enemies in the world. There are only ever-shifting interests. And so your interests may dictate that country A is your enemy one day and your ally the next.
The Chinese Navy is now the largest in the world. And as the U.S. Navy prepares to decommission more of its own ships...
Okay, it doesn't really matter that China's Navy is the largest in the world, right? What matters is how effective they are, right? Numbers, all right? I know in the promiscuity world, have a friend who says that the numbers of women that you sleep with takes on a quality all of its own. But when it comes to a Navy, simply largest number of vessels doesn't really matter much. The Chinese Navy is weak. It can be shredded overnight. Very little of the Chinese Navy can fight effectively, say more than 500 miles offshore. That means that a couple of destroyers in the Indian Ocean can shut off imports and exports from China. Right? China has to import almost all its energy. A couple of destroyers in the Indian Ocean can just shut off China's energy imports, and within a year, 500 million Chinese would starve. Yeah, China has 2 old French aircraft carriers, and the rest of the stuff is made in China. Like, what Chinese goods do you most associate with quality? I can't really think of any Chinese goods that I associate with quality. This is from the New Yorker, dangerous game over Taiwan.
The gap is expected to grow. China's ships and submarines are widely regarded as less effective than their American equivalents, but the Chinese are rapidly modernizing. China's growing capability...
Yeah, China does have nuclear weapons. So we certainly can't treat them with gratuitous contempt.
...abilities have coincided with an increasingly aggressive approach to foreign policy. For years,
So why is China being increasingly aggressive with foreign policy? Because it can, because its economy and military is growing stronger. Also, it's heading into more desperate territory. Like, it's run into severe economic headwinds in the last few years. It has astronomical levels of debt. It's going through a dramatic demographic crisis. Like, all these crises are hitting at once. So China is in a vulnerable position, kind of similar to Germany before World War I. So if Germany had launched its attacks against France and the rest of Europe in 1900, Germany would have won World War I. US has the stomach for hundreds of millions of dead Asians, but not for thousands of dead American boys with names like Bobby Lee and Leroy Jones. Yeah, so China has more capacity for suffering, right? China can lose millions of people and it's not such a big deal. Right? The United States loses hundreds of people, it's a very big deal. Like, we put a higher value of life in the West. So, dangerous game over Taiwan. Dexter Filkins writing here in the New
Leaders
Yorker.
seldom boasted of their country's military prowess, following the dictum of the former leader Deng Xiaoping to hide your strength, bide your time, as the economy grew. Since
You don't understand the disdain for China. Well, why would anyone venerate China? I mean, they have behaved like a bad actor in international relations. They steal technology. They, try to bribe other politicians and nations. So almost no nation has a natural incentive to revere China or to ally with China. China behaved badly. China's given us almost every major pandemic. Right? You think COVID was bad? China also gave us the Spanish flu in 1919. China's given us every major pandemic over the past 100 years. They have not conducted themselves in ways that cause disinterested people to respect or revere them. China has virtually no friends in the world.
becoming the head of the CCP in 2013, Xi Jinping has abandoned that precept. He set no deadline for bringing Taiwan into China, but suggested that he intended to be in office when it happened. The Taiwan question, he said, cannot be passed from generation to generation. Last year, in a speech commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, he warned, "The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully, coerce, and enslave us. Whoever attempts to do it will surely break their heads on the steel Great Wall built with the blood and flesh of 1.4 billion Chinese people."
Very scary rhetoric. Wow. Who could stand up to that?
Xi's re-election as party chairman in October appeared to herald a new era of assertiveness. He emerged from the party congress, held in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, stronger than ever. He purged his main rivals in the Politburo and its standing committee, many of them market-oriented technocrats, and elevated loyalists, most of them drawn from the...
It's kind of funny that President Xi is stronger than ever, because he hasn't really done anything right for years. Like, everything he's done has been an absolute disaster. From zero COVID to crashing economy, demographic collapse, completely alienated other nations in the world. Right? So he's intimidated people from telling him the truth. China's increasingly badly governed, and they've got a dictator with more power than anyone since Mao, maybe even more power than Mao had.
The military.
4-hour vacation streams. Let's go. Let's party, guys.
Security establishment. In one highly visible moment, Xi looked on as his aging predecessor, Hu Jintao, was roughly escorted from the stage. Several of Hu's allies, most of them relative moderates, were soon expelled from the party. In his speech to the party congress, Xi...
So there's such a thing as too much power. Like, I've had bosses who are a-holes. When you have a boss who's an a-hole, you're kind of more reluctant to give them information that they're not going to deal well with. Right? You're not going to give them the benefit of the doubt. So you can get too much power over people. You can scare people too much. And so they simply abstain from giving you the information that you need. Great thing about capitalism and a free market is that it's constantly relaying information. Right? The prices are information. If you get a free market in goods or free market in ideas, then you have much better access to information than if you're a dictator, whereby people are afraid to tell you the truth, which seems to be the situation in both Soviet Union and China, but it seems to be even worse with China. Xi will be dealt with in a palace coup that may very well level the palace through to the basement. Yeah.
warned of dangerous storms ahead. and ordered leaders to prepare for an era of struggle, a word that was edited into the party's charter in 7 places. Phrases that suggested stability.
All right, struggle, that indicates that things are really tough for us right now. If you ask a mate, how you doing? And he says, oh, I'm struggling, right? In all likelihood, that means things aren't going very well. And things are not going well for China.
Like peace and development will remain the themes of the era, were removed from a report accompanying the speech. Our country has entered a period when strategic opportunity coexists with risks and challenges, she told the party's leaders. The world has entered a period of turbulence and transformation.
How does he really know what's going on in the world, given that he's like executed anyone who's brought in news he didn't want to hear? Right? Think about how distorted his information is.
Western experts say that Xi's ultimate ambition is for China to supplant the United States as the world's preeminent power. His goal is what he calls China's great rejuvenation, the recovery of national power, pride, and territory that fell away in the 19th century, with much of it surrendered to the West. Making Taiwan part of China, Xi has said.
So, in the 19th century, right, during the Opium Wars with Great Britain, China had the most powerful, the biggest military in the world and the biggest GNP in the world. Yet Great Britain could just send a few boats over to China and crush it. Why? Because China had to spend much of its military just maintaining internal order. Like the United States does not need to use its military to maintain internal order. China still has to use much of its military to maintain internal order. Also, size of GNP, that doesn't really measure much. Right? GNP is a really shoddy way for measuring economic growth. So much of China's GNP goes towards building cities that nobody lives in. Right? There's a lot of nonsense building. It's the equivalent of creating a hole and then filling it back up. What you want to know is how much bang for the buck can you get? And China is saddled with that. And so I've been talking about China's economic problems for 4 years on this live stream. And when I started doing it on a regular basis, people said, China's going to be the next great power. It's on a trajectory to overcome the US if it hasn't already overcome the US. Nobody talks that way anymore. It's very clear that China is not on a trajectory to overcome the United States right now and become the world's next great superpower. In all out war, China will lose control over provinces. China will retract its own footprint. As it has time and again in history, it expands to about the size it is now and retracts. Yeah. And so Peter Zion says he doesn't expect that there will be a China as we know it now in a decade. Xi took what took decades to build, and he's burning it down. Right? But Peter Zion doesn't expect that there will be a new version of the iPhone because Apple has invested almost all its manufacturing in China, and China's falling apart. Like with zero COVID policies, right? Manufacturing in China has been absolutely crushed. The Chinese COVID vaccines don't work. So if they don't have zero COVID policies, draconian, stay-at-home orders, then millions of people will die from COVID because their vaccines don't work.
Is one of his project's crucial chapters. For many
Apple is trying to use Indian factories increasingly as a hedge against the collapse of their manufacturing base in China. Xi is the best thing to ever happen to the West. Yeah, he is so threatened and intimidated and murdered people who bring him bad news that Xi is getting really faulty information.
China specialists in the West. The speech was a watershed. There are no longer any checks on Xi's power within the system. Matt Pottinger, who served as Deputy National Security Advisor under President Donald Trump, and is now a visiting fellow at the WHO.
So if there are no checks on my power, I'd do a lot of really stupid things. I would indulge my whims. Anyone with unchecked power is very dangerous to their society and to themselves.
Hoover Institution told me. Any checks that now exist are external to China. Inside the system, Xi can do what he wants, including starting a war. Several times a year, David Ochmanek, a former Pentagon official who is now at the Rand Corporation in Washington, assembles Navy and Air Force officers and officials to conduct war games between the US and China over Taiwan. The participants gather around a large map showing forces arrayed across the region. Those playing the Chinese leaders are steeped in knowledge of China's decision-making. All have access to the US government's best information. The war games are so real.
Okay, I don't think they have access to the US's best information. So it said earlier in this article that there's no country that we talk to more, that we are more closely entwined with than Taiwan. We just don't talk about that publicly. But the US is deeply entwined with Taiwan, right? Joe Biden has repeatedly said that, yeah, the United States will go to war to defend. Bloody hell, just trying to do a podcast here, and here come the ways that they're waging war against my cheap Oppo Aussie phone. Bloody hell.
That the participants are exhausted and stressed out. They take them very seriously, Ochmanek told me. The simulations take many forms, but usually start with a crisis, like the election of a pro-independence president of Taiwan, or with an outright invasion. Many of them end badly for the United States, Ochmanek.
Brandon says once the United States builds chip factories in the US, they will dispense with Taiwan. No. If the US abandons Taiwan, that will signal to its other allies like Korea and Japan, Vietnam and the Philippines that making an alliance with the United States is not a good bet because the US is fickle. So to maintain its alliances, particularly with Japan and with Australia, Philippines, Vietnam, Korea, right? To maintain this anti-China alliance system, the US has to defend Taiwan. If the US surrenders Taiwan, China will expand outward in power, start threatening more and more of the nations in the South China Sea, start threatening Japan. Now, the US will still care about Taiwan, even if they didn't get any important computer chips from Taiwan for strategic reasons, because the other allies in this anti-China coalition, all right, will lose faith in the US and start siding more with China.
Said, we usually lose. Sometimes the Chinese military is able to keep the US Navy at bay and capture Taiwan. Sometimes the Chinese sink US aircraft carriers. This puts the burden on the participants who are mimicking American officials. Do they give up or escalate? Do they strike China itself? Sometimes, when the US attacks the Chinese mainland, the Chinese attack Alaska and Hawaii, he said. The losses are very heavy. It's not always so dire, Ochmanek said. In some cases, the United States prevails. And even the games that the US loses are not necessarily reflective of how a war would unfold in...
And the chat says China cannot maintain the large number of secured deep water ports. I think you're exaggerating Xi's limited knowledge and disciplinary measures. I'm sure he has many trusted sources and people who report accurately information for his use, says the chat. Maybe. Obviously, I'm no China expert. I'm just a bloke who reads the news and reads books and reads academic papers and listens to a lot of podcasts and has a lot of spare time to pursue his interests. But I just enjoy the challenge of trying to match, my thinking with reality and seeing how well I do. So this is Dexter Filkins in the New Yorker.
Real life. The main purpose is to evaluate American vulnerabilities. We learn a lot from these, Ochmanek said. Like the war games, almost everything about a potential war with China over Taiwan is theoretical. For the Americans and the Taiwanese, gauging whether and how a war might start involves...
So I started playing games, like card games like Risk, around 1979, and then I started inventing my own games for how to be like president of the United States and how to deal with, double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, skyrocketing budget deficits, all these, multiple problems. And so I designed my own strategy game. So yeah, I love strategy since I was a kid. Like around, I think by age 8 or 9, I could name every single king and queen of England. I've always loved English history. I think the English love their history more than any other nation. So I always loved strategy. I've always loved putting my mind up against reality.
Involves assessments of each country's capabilities and objectives, as well as some calculation of the costs that...
I learned my foreign policy from Risk. No, but that's I think the first game I played about war and international relations. I remember I'd get so angry when somebody would attack me. I remember you'd have those brutal battles, like just to the death. And once they start attacking you to conquer your land, like even if you won and survived, you'd be so weak. Luke Ford only does peer-reviewed foreign policy, bro. That's right. All right, back to the New Yorker article from Dexter Filkins. The dangerous game.
Each side would be willing to bear. For American policymakers, that means trying to determine what is required to dissuade China from attempting to change the status quo by force, or if it does, how to make any war so painful that China would stop without achieving its goals.
Well, it should be pretty easy to stop China's ability to import petroleum and other forms of energy. And without that, China starves within a year.
American and Taiwanese experts agree that an invasion of Taiwan would be a colossal gamble for the Chinese leadership.
Whoa, I can't help reminiscing right now to that heady time about 2 minutes ago when I had 11 live viewers. I mean, I'm not letting it go to my head. But, I mean, do you remember that exciting time that we shared about 2 minutes ago when we had 11 live viewers? I mean, people were just flocking in here. I mean, the power that we wielded then, those were the days.
A full-scale invasion would likely begin with cyber and missile attacks on Taiwanese military infrastructure, and possibly with an assault by airborne troops. But eventually, an invading force of tens or possibly hundreds of thousands of soldiers would have to cross 100 miles of water, capture the island's difficult terrain, and sustain an occupation, presumably while under constant attack. In testimony before Congress last year, Admiral Phil Davidson, then the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, expressed concern that China could try to take Taiwan before 2027, the year its military modernization.
40, is this the peer-reviewed Taiwan invasion, bro? So I'm sitting here on these very hard rocks. I've been sitting here for 48 minutes on this live stream, trying to shelter out of the wind, right? Trying to give you the high quality audio, trying to drop paratroopers. Their planes would be shot out of the sky while still over water, says the chat. So I've got my sunglasses just hanging out there. I can't seem to read the chat when I've got sunglasses on. I'm just sitting here by the dock of the bay doing some live streaming before I resume my walkabout south of Sydney Harbour Bridge. Back to the New Yorker.
Is scheduled to be complete. I think our conventional deterrent is actually eroding, he said. I worry that they are accelerating their ambitions to supplant the United States and our leadership role in the rules-based international order, which they have long said that they want to do by 2050.
Okay, the rules-based international order. All right, it's something to that, right? If you can get on the same page with other people, that's a good thing. Uh-oh, here comes the wind. So I'm gonna switch location of my Oppo device for that high-quality audio that you expect from me. Come on, guys, once we put our transsexual paratroopers into operation, once we start doing gay ops against China, I don't think China stands a chance against LGBTQ strong United States of America. We're going to be installing gay discos in Shanghai any day now. Imagine, the fear. How come out with some hot younger Australian women, bro, to impregnate? 40 needs to have nice Jewish converted kids, bro. Just taking a break from that hard work. So when our transsexual parachuters, right, start landing in Shanghai, I think they're going to absolutely strike terror into the Chinese. They'll see the error of their ways. They'll start instituting gay marriage. They'll open up, big gay discos. We'll be fighting for gay rights. I think Aussie women would reject Chinese men.
I am worried about them moving that target closer.
Yep, Globo Homo's coming for you, China. Time to open up the gay discos. Yeah, generally speaking, white women are not interested in Asian men. So I see about 4 times as many Asian women with white men as I see vice versa. I don't see many white men with black women. I probably see 3 times as many black men with white women as vice versa. But I don't see race. I don't see color. I just see one love.
Taiwan is clearly one of their ambitions before then. Some American officials and experts believe that China's advantages will begin to wane later in the decade. A new generation of U.S. defense improvements is scheduled to come online, and America's defense industrial base, now attenuated, will be revived. Or so goes the hope. Many of the same experts believe that China might be entering a long-term economic slowdown, brought on by a rapidly aging population and a maturing economy.
Yeah.
My sense is that the window...
China doesn't really innovate. I mean, they steal technology. Now they only have access to the lowest level computer chips. Asian men are not only poorly endowed, just not attracted to Western women. I attended UCLA at that time. It stood for Ugly Caucasians, Lovely Asians. I attended UCLA in 1988-89. I was told UCLA stood for United Caucasians Lost Among Asians.
It was opening now, and that it won't be open forever. Elbridge Colby, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under Trump, told me. Taiwanese officials say that they are determined to repel an invasion on their own. We think we would win, Wu, the former minister, told me. But almost no one outside Taiwan believes this. There is no scenario in which Taiwan can defend itself. Oriana Schuyler Mastro, a fellow at Stanford University, strategic planner for Pacific Command in the Air Force Reserves, told me. A realistic goal would be to slow down a Chinese invasion in order to give the U.S., if it chooses to intervene, time to marshal its forces and cover the vast...
Right. Nobody outside of Taiwan seems to think that Taiwan on its own can defend itself.
Distances to get there. A senior American military officer told me that Taiwan would have to hold off the Chinese for about 6 weeks. We think it's in our favor if it takes 45 days, the officer said. China's goal would likely be to seize Taiwan as quickly as possible, to present the U.S. with a fait accompli. According to American officials, Beijing worries that it would be unlikely to win a protracted conflict, as the U.S. gathered its allies and revitalized its industrial base. The longer it goes, the more difficult it gets for the Chinese, Mastro told me.
Right, so if China's going to invade Taiwan, right, they should do it in the next 5 years. They should even do it in the next year or two. That would be in their strategic interest, just as Germany would have won World War I if they'd launched it 10 years earlier. So more than 5 years out, China's chances will be considerably diminished. Yeah, can Taiwan hold on? Right, 6 weeks sounds about right. That's how long they'll need to last.
For years, Taiwan's plan for its defense was to attack the mainland bases that would support an invasion. The strategy is to go to the origin. Chang, the former deputy commander of the Taiwanese Air Force, told me. The Taiwanese military maintains a formidable conventional force, consisting of fighter bombers, cruise missiles, and anti-ship missiles. But Taiwan's strategy was designed in the years when its military was closer to parity with China's. Li Shimin, who served as chief of the general staff of the Taiwanese military until he retired in 2019, told me that he had pushed for reform without...
So I hope there's not nuclear war in the world and Australia's like the last outpost and we're just sitting here by the dock of the bay, waiting for the radiation to roll in, knowing that human life is going to be extinguished on our planet. And this is like the last outpost, but it's just a matter of days until the nuclear radiation rolls in. Wait, that was a novel, that was a movie. What was that movie? It was shot in the 1950s, and then there was a Showtime version. But in both versions, Australia is like the last outpost before nuclear radiation, eradicates life as we know it.
Success. The government didn't listen to me, he said. As China's capabilities have raced ahead, American officials have begun prodding Taiwan to rely instead on a defensive porcupine strategy.
Yes, On the Beach, the novel by Neville Shute. And then the movie was done by that, left-wing social activist.
Which would aim to slow down an invading force using sea mines, anti-ship missiles, and other inexpensive weapons. Taiwanese defense officials have resisted.
So there are all sorts of great YouTube videos on what it would look like if China invades Taiwan. I mean, they're really fun to watch. Now, this is from the New Yorker.
According to
Dangerous
officials
game.
in both countries. Earlier this year, Taiwan asked to buy a number of American MH-60R Seahawk helicopters used for hunting submarines. The State Department rejected the request, which officials considered emblematic of the old strategy. They're stuck in the 1980s, the senior American official told me.
Yeah, it's perplexing how little effort Taiwan puts into defending itself. Like they only spend about 1% of their GDP on their armed forces. Yeah, they have a national draft, but it only lasts 4 months. It's not rigorous. People spend most of their time cleaning and pulling weeds. Right? They only do a little bit of firing of weapons. Taiwan is putting so little effort into defending itself that it makes it harder for the United States to risk itself to defend it when Taiwan can't be bothered to defend itself. Why are the Taiwanese so weak and wimpy? When would Taiwan man up? Like get ready to defend itself? Pathetic.
This year, as pressure from China has increased, the Taiwanese government has acted more urgently. The legislature has approved $8 billion in emergency defense spending for things such as drones, anti-ballistic missile radar, and patrol boats, all made domestically. But these programs will take time. Until then, the biggest obstacle to preparing Taiwan for a conflict appears to be supplies from the United States. Taiwanese officials told me that they are waiting on the delivery of $14 billion worth of military hardware, including scores of sea mines and...
So there's tons of reshoring going on in the United States. Like all sorts of manufacturing is moving back into America because given that we've got, the best tech, right, it's often now cheaper to manufacture in America. And so reshoring is bringing manufacturing jobs back to the country. We're going to start manufacturing more computer chips, all sorts of goods are going to be manufactured here instead of being imported from abroad.
Anti-ship missiles, the very weapons the Americans have been urging them to buy. One reason, officials say, is that U.S. warehouses have been stripped bare by the conflict in Ukraine. The Ukraine war has showed us that we don't have the ammunition stocks to sustain a medium-sized war, the senior administration official said. We don't have the industrial base. But Pottinger...
Okay, the chat says that Du has been very occupied doing MobTube stuff with John Wolfe. I need to get on the MobTube grift, bro. Big money. Yeah, how much money are people raking in with MobTube? Inquiring minds want to know. Is it more than China versus Taiwan conflict? More than this compelling material? I mean, you don't get this kind of quality anywhere, guys. Okay, dangerous game over Taiwan. Dude has $10 million trust, bro. Big money. Oh, come on, mate. This is Dexter Filkins here, writing in the New Yorker. Why aren't I hearing it? Oh man, why am I having technical issues? Just when the live stream is getting good.
The demands of supplying Ukraine didn't explain all the delays. Stingers and Javelin anti-tank missiles are going to Ukraine, but Harpoon anti-ship missiles are not. The Pentagon procurement system is so screwed up and totally bizarre. Our procurement is asleep. Saudi Arabia is in line to receive the Harpoons before Taiwan. We are not arming ourselves or our friends for the most dangerous.
Okay, why are we giving important weaponry to Saudi Arabia ahead of Taiwan? Right, Taiwan is much more important.
Dangerous fight. The biggest question of all is whether America would intervene. Since the early 1980s, the U.S. has had no legal obligation to defend Taiwan.
Okay, whether or not you have a legal obligation, what matters is whether it's in your strategic interest. Plenty of people have gone back on legal obligations. Right? Is it in America's strategic interest to militarily intervene over Taiwan? Well, that depends on many different factors, including how much is Taiwan ready to sacrifice to defend itself? If Taiwan's not willing to sacrifice to defend itself, then why should America?
But because the American Navy was overwhelmingly dominant, the question wasn't urgent. As China has grown more powerful and Xi's rhetoric more threatening, the matter has become more acute. In recent months, Biden has publicly promised on 4 occasions to defend Taiwan. Biden's statements buoyed Taiwanese officials. 4th time, one texted me after the latest pledge. But White House officials say publicly that American policy remains unchanged. The Biden White House seems sharply aware of the consequences of failing to ensure Taiwan's independence. Allowing the island to fall would give the Chinese Navy unrestricted access to the open oceans, as well as effective dominance in the sea lanes of the Western Pacific, through which more than $3 trillion worth of goods passes each year.
Okay, this is a nice little live stream. Take care, guys. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. So when you write in the chat, do you feel like you're going down deep into the depths of your soul to produce your comments? Or do you feel like you're rising up out of the abyss? Do you feel like you are deepening some ineffable experience that you're already holding? Have you considered putting together your YouTube comments into an oeuvre? That's what this New Yorker essay on our current Nobel Prize winner in literature evokes for me. It is titled Memory Serves.
1997. The English translation is by Tanya Leslie. Its opening is unforgettable. My father tried to kill my mother one Sunday in June in the early afternoon. That was in the summer of 1952.
Oh, that sounds good, doesn't it? That sounds like a compelling piece of writing. So she writes in depth about how much she suffered because when she was growing up in Spain, it was stigmatized to have sex outside of marriage, and it was considered shameful to get pregnant outside of marriage. Can you imagine how she suffered? And then she went and had sex without being concerned about birth control, and shockingly she got pregnant, and then abortion was illegal in France until 1975, so she had to go around as a 23-year-old woman to try to find an illegal abortion. I mean, she got the Nobel Prize in Literature as a response to the United States Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, overturning a woman's automatic right to an abortion anywhere in the United States. So, 3 cheers for Ernaux. She basically just writes about herself, but so beautifully and in such a French way.
When Ernaux was 11, it took her nearly 45 years to try to make sense of what this terrifying event meant to her. And by the book's end, she's still not sure that she has.
Oh man, this sounds great. I got to read this book.
I I have always wanted to write the sort of book that I find it impossible to talk about afterward. The sort of book that makes it impossible for me to withstand the gaze of others.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what drives my YouTube live streaming. I want to produce live streams that are impossible to talk about afterwards, and that make it absolutely impossible for me to withstand the gaze of other people afterwards. I mean, I just feel like that my soul and any Ernaux soul are just like commingled. We are one. We are two fine-souled people.
She writes, this paradoxical wish to reveal the darkest parts of herself with such pitiless accuracy that she will be forced to fall silent once and for all is an extraordinary expression of writerly ambition.
Yeah, not just writerly ambition. This is what drives me, the humble YouTube live streamer.
In any case, it has still not come true.
Still not come true for me either, and I'm 56. Okay, any Ernaux is 82.
The purpose of Ernaux's writing, she believes, is not merely to record things that have happened, but to make things exist.
Yeah, that's the same way I feel about my live streams. I'm not just here to record what's happening. I'm here to make them exist, such as this boat that's now entering from the right side of the frame as I look at my phone, moving towards the left frame. I summoned this boat. I'm making it exist.
This is strong, but it is hardly the strongest thing she has to say about her work. I am a medium, she told me. I feel that I'm someone who can transmit things. Much of what Ernaux
Wow. Wow. She's a medium. She's someone who can transmit things. This is powerful stuff. I mean, I think I'm a medium too. Like I'm someone who can transmit things.
transmits what it is to grow up working class in a society that is contemptuous of workers.
Yeah, so do you feel like you're here to transmit things too? Are you ready to talk about what it's like to grow up in a cruel society that is contemptuous of workers? Like, this is a time to speak your truth.
What it is to be a woman dispossessed of her body by the laws of the state.
I too feel like a woman who's been dispossessed of my body by the laws of the state. I mean, do you feel like a woman right now? Do you feel like you're a woman who's been dispossessed by the state of the right to her own body? That's just what I'm feeling right now. Maybe we could feel like women together. Doesn't that sound like jolly fun? I think so.
Or by the overpowering prerogatives of desire.
Oh yeah. Yeah, this is a open space. This is a safe space for you to share what it's like for you to be overwhelmed by desire. So when men are overwhelmed by the prerogatives of desire and they have the opportunity, they rape. So how sublime is that? I mean, she's sublimely overwhelmed by the prerogatives of her body. Like, let's hear from the men in the chat who too are sublimely overwhelmed by the prerogatives of their bodies. I mean, if you feel something, then you must act on it, right? You don't want to repress your feelings. You don't want to give the state, the key to your soul, do you?
Has made her a literary model, even a hero, to those who have shared similar experiences or points of view.
Oh yeah, this is my hero. This is my hero, man. How wonderful to hear from someone who has suffered from the prerogatives of the body, where the body just takes over and she submits to the body's desires. I mean, this is such edgy stuff. This is amazing. What world are you in? I am in Sydney Harbour, mate. And Annie Ernaux, she lives in France, where she had to live her life submitting to the state. Here it is pitch black and freezing. Well, we had a hailstorm about 45 minutes ago. It was very exciting.
Ernaux's book, Happening, in which she describes seeking an illegal abortion as a 23-year-old student, is a feminist touchstone.
Oh yeah, I just haven't read enough feminist touchstones. Boy, that sounds good. I really want to know what it was like to be a 23-year-old student in France seeking an illegal abortion after having sex without making any considerations of birth control. Boy, this sounds like great stuff. Powerful feminist theory.
Adapted last year into a movie by the director Audrey Diwan.
So it is now 2:48 p.m. in Sydney, Australia, and I'm here to create a safe place for you to share about what it was like to be overcome by the prerogatives of the body's desires. Let's share some of our recollections from the male point of view.
Just like Didier Eribon, Edouard Louis, and Marie Ndiaye are openly indebted to Ernaux in both substance and style.
Wow, I never knew that. I can't believe how indebted we are. It is now Wednesday, 2:28 p.m., Sydney, Australia.
Ernaux has been asked if she is proud to have been adopted as a kind of literary godmother, or even as a spokesperson.
Yeah, I too feel proud to be adopted as a live streaming godfather. Yes, I am living in the future, but I am reaching out to speak to you in the past. I am here to warn you that if you don't mend your ways, this is the type of place where you'll end up, mate. I'm speaking as the ghost of your Christmas future. Heed my words, my son.
She feels that pride is the wrong word. I never wanted to write for, Ernaux told me. I write from.
Yeah, that's the same experience for me. I've never wanted to live stream for, I just want to live stream from. Such a profound difference. Right? I'm not here to serve an audience beyond the audience of me. Let's talk about me. So her entire oeuvre is just writing about herself. And it's marvelous stuff. She produces feminist touchstones, guys.
Still, she was moved by the joy with which readers greeted the Nobel announcement.
I will never forget my joy when I learned that Annie Ernaux had won the Nobel Prize for Literature. I'll never forget where I was. I assume I was at work somewhere. Oh, such joy. Such sweet delight.
She considered the prize a collective achievement.
Yeah, I consider these live streams a collective achievement. Right? It's you and me having social intercourse. Am I a cannabis user? No, I loathe cannabis. Loathe cannabis. I've never tried marijuana in my life. I've never tried any illegal drug in my life. I don't drink. I loathe these things.
The same things that make many people love Ernaux make many others despise her. Relentlessly personal in her art, she has, in public life, taken on the role of the écrivaine engagée, outspokenly committed to a host of left-wing political causes.
Wow, who would have thought that someone outspokenly committed to a host of left-wing causes will have drawn a negative reaction from the right? This is shocking stuff, mate. Wow. Can't believe this.
And while she was being appreciated in New York, accusations lobbed by her conservative detractors were flying fast in France.
So sad.
Ernaux was an anti-Semite. She supports the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement as a way of
She's not anti-Semitic. She just believes that Jews are the one people in the world who don't deserve to have their own state. Just because she singles out Jews as the one people in the world who don't deserve their own state, that doesn't make her anti-Jewish. Does Donald Trump have a shot in 2024? Yes, he has a shot. I'd say he probably has a 50% chance of winning the Republican nomination, and then another 50% chance of winning the election. So we're outside the Crown Royal Casino on Sydney Harbour right now. Absolutely.
advancing the Palestinian cause. An Islamo-fascist, she considers French antipathy to the hijab to be a means of silencing women. A
Yeah, antipathy to the hijab. If you don't want women walking around in a hijab, right? If you believe that women should show their faces in public, that means that you hate women, right? Look, does love change for the worse in Australia depending on who is? Does life change for the worse in Australia depending on who is elected to power in the United States? Well, guess what? Life doesn't really change for the better or for the worse depending on who's elected to power in the United States for Americans, right? Life under Joe Biden is indistinguishable from life under Donald Trump unless you're a political junkie. So whoever is chosen president in the United States practically makes virtually no difference to how ordinary people live their lives, and it doesn't really make a difference to how Australians live their lives either, right? if you completely ignored politics, all right, your life would just go on. It wouldn't be crippled, right? What difference does it make to your life? Practically, yeah, but everyone's suffering from inflation right now. Okay, what first world nation is not suffering from inflation? If Donald Trump was president, we'd be suffering from inflation. Now, maybe you'd be a point lower, maybe even be 2 points lower, but it wouldn't be more than 2 points lower. So instead of suffering 8% inflation this year, we'd only be suffering 6% inflation.
Her latest book, Le Jeune Homme, recounts an affair that Ernaux had in her 50s with a man some 30 years her junior. Wokiste.
Oh boy, I can't wait to read that. Love reading books about 50-year-old women who who have affairs with men 30 years they do it. Yeah, the lower the better. So inflation points are small. But if people are struggling with inflation, primarily means they don't have their lives together. I think Ed Dutton was right. We're not suffering through an inflation crisis nearly as much as a dysgenic crisis. People have gotten so soft, so flabby. People have gotten how to discipline themselves to save money. People have forgotten how to plant their own food, how to cook their own food, and they just become so pathetic and weak that they're just getting smacked around by an increase in inflation or anything that goes wrong. They're absolutely devastated because they live in such precarious ways. So when I had to move in 2011, that was devastating for me because I was in such straitened economic circumstances. If I'd had more money saved, and if I'd been in a better position in life, I wouldn't have been so devastated by moving. But when your hold on life is fragile, when you don't have it together, then the smallest disruption can be devastating. Now, smart budgeting types are not being devastated by inflation of 8%, right? If you're being devastated by 8% inflation, there's something wrong with you. Something wrong with how you budget. Something wrong with how you save. There's something wrong with how effectively you work and earn money. Now, it definitely makes life more difficult, particularly if gasoline prices double, right? And you depend on driving 3 hours a day. So it can certainly make life more difficult. But the better shape you are, the more centered you are morally, spiritually, financially, right? The more savings you have, the more capable you are, the more friends you have, the stronger your community, then the better you're going to be able to deal with any threat. Like, what's the best way to survive inflation? Have friends and community. What's the best way to survive an earthquake? Have friends and community. What's the best way to survive a war? Have friends and community. What's the best way to survive a recession or depression? Have friends and community. What's the best way to overcome medical crisis? Have friends and community. What's the best way to overcome suffering a car accident? Have friends and community. What's the best way to survive being disabled at work? Have friends and community. What's the best way to survive the loss of your parents? To have friends and community. What's the best way to survive your computer not working? Have friends and community. What's the best way to survive the loss of a relationship? To have friends and community. What's the best way to survive a car that doesn't start? Have friends and community. What's the best way to survive losing your job? Have friends and community. Right? The best way to survive any crisis, any difficult situation, is to have friends and community and to reason socially. Right? To have people you bounce things off where they learn from you, you learn from them. We learn much better when we learn together. This is from the New Yorker. Memory serves about our latest Nobel Prize winner in literature. She got the prize because it was a reaction of the Nobel Committee to America overturning Roe v. Wade.
The same things that make many people love Ernaux make many others despise her. Relentlessly personal in her art, she has, in public life, taken on the role of the écrivaine engagée, outspokenly committed to a host of left-wing political causes. And while she was being appreciated in New York, accusations lobbed by her conservative detractors were flying fast in France. Ernaux was an anti...
So, guess what? If you become an agent provocateur for the right or left, the other side politically is going to oppose you. For every action, there's a reaction.
Semite. She supports the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement as a way of advancing the Palestinian cause. An Islamo-fascist, she considers French antipathy to the hijab to be a means of silencing women. A pedophile. Her latest book, Le Jeune Homme, recounts an affair that Ernaux had in her 50s with a man some 30 years her junior.
Okay, if you're in your 50s having an affair with a man 30 years your junior, that has absolutely no connection, nothing to do with pedophilia.
Wokiste. She is a proponent of #MeToo and of the Gilets jaunes. Decidedly, this academy of old shriveled bigwigs has gone a step further into the absurd and the indecent, railed one editorial beneath the headline, "The Nobel in Literature Definitively Discredited."
Well, I don't know about you, but how excited was I to find out that our latest Nobel Prize winner in literature was a French woman. I mean, that just had such overwhelming meaning to me.
In the conservative newspaper Le Figaro, a writer disparaged the decision to award the high priestess of autofiction for a lifetime spent writing about herself. "They think I'm not legitimate," Ernaux said to me. "What disgusts them is that there are people who have found in literature something that speaks to them, and that those people aren't CEOs or company bosses."
Okay, so I don't really know any Ernaux, I don't really know about her critics, and I don't know her books, and I don't know the criticisms of her books, but I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say I reckon that the criticisms of her have absolutely nothing to do with the fact that people who aren't CEOs can enjoy literature. I mean, what a fatuous statement she just made.
Ernaux is also the first French woman to win the Nobel,
Oh,
and
wow.
that doesn't work for them at all.
Oh, no.
For years, she has dealt with sexist criticism of her work, and not just from the right. After
Oh, no, sexist criticism. Guys, because she's a woman, she should not be criticized at all. To criticize her, a woman, is to be sexist. To criticize a person of color is inherently to be racist. You don't want to do any of that. Come on, remember guys, we have sacred groups. We need to be immune from all group level criticism or even personal criticism. You can't criticize sacred groups, protected groups, guys.
he published Simple Passion, a soul-bearing account of a love affair with a married man, a literary critic at the liberal weekly Le Nouvel Observateur took to calling her Madame Ovary.
Oh, thank God that she published this memoir about her affair with a married man who's a literary critic. Boy, can't wait to read it.
I suggested to Ernaux that there might be something validating in the present outpouring of loathing. Hadn't she been writing for years about the contempt of the rich for the poor, of men for women, of the dominant for the downtrodden? It's proof, she agreed. Still, it depressed her. In the uproar, Ernaux saw a renewal of the frightening wave of outrage that had engulfed her 10 years ago, when she published a column in Le Monde decrying a literary elegy for Anders Breivik, a barely concealed apologia for the Norwegian mass murderer by Richard Millet, an author and editor at Gallimard. While condemning Breivik's crimes, Millet blamed them on multiculturalism and the erosion of European Christian identity. Ernaux called his text a fascist pamphlet that dishonors literature.
Okay, I think there are a lot of things more important. All right, an apology for Anders Breivik. Right, sounds disgusting. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with fascism. All right, you can just be opposed to mass murder and be revolted by mass murder and absolutely revolted by what Anders Breivik did. Right?
3 days later, Millet stepped down from Gallimard's prestigious reading committee.
Yeah, if you write articles, apologizing for mass murderers, there'll probably be some negative repercussions.
Many others shared Ernaux's disgust. For instance, J.M.G. Leclésio, Nobeled in 2008. But Ernaux's column, countersigned by 118 fellow writers, was seized.
That's what I loathe, right? When people write these columns, that are countersigned by 120 other writers or 88 other writers. Like, who needs all these intellectuals signing on to your column? Come on.
As a flashpoint, l'affaire Richard Millet.
I'm not a big fan of groupthink.
became a kind of referendum on what wasn't yet termed cancel culture, with Ernaux denounced as a harridan intent on enforcing politically correct censorship at the expense of a man's career.
Look, if you're a guy writing an apology for a mass murderer, right, and you suffer some social consequences, that's your own fault.
I was called a killer, Ernaux said. She herself felt that it was really a halali, a hunting call, with Ernaux as the chased stag.
Yeah, she's the victim here, right? It's very easy to feel like the victim.
One of the phrases most associated with Ernaux, transfuge de classe, can seem derogatory. A transfuge is a defector. But Ernaux herself uses the term, partly as an objective description of her situation as a woman who, by dint of education, rose to the middle class, and then, by force of talent, to the cultural elite. And partly, it can seem, as a kind of deserved epithet that expresses her own ambivalent feelings at having moved so far from the world of her parents.
Well, her parents weren't in particularly good shape, all right? They were in desperate shape, so I'm not sure exactly why you'd feel so ambivalent about that. Let's fast forward through the story.
Narrative of willing captivity. During the months of her affair with A, as she calls her lover, Ernaux bends toward him as a flower toward the sun. She stays at home when she should go out. She doesn't use the vacuum cleaner for fear of covering the phone's ring.
Okay, so she's a sex and love addict, and here she is having an affair with a man 3 decades younger than her, and this is her in her 50s. So, sounds like classic sex and love addiction.
A is a foreigner, an Eastern European. His weakness for Western luxuries reminds Ernaux of herself as a teenage parvenue, craving the dresses and vacations that her richer friends had. A shares none of her intellectual interests, but so what? She herself can only listen to love songs. After A returns home, Ernaux grows morbid. If he has given her AIDS, she thinks, at least he would have left me that. And yet...
Yes, if only he'd given me AIDS. Right? There's nothing that kind of warms the heart like a departing lover who leaves you with the ongoing gift of AIDS.
But she explains in simple passion, the passage of time can also be a comfort, even a creative necessity. Naturally, I feel no shame in writing these things because of the time which separates the moment when they are written, when only I can see them, from the moment when they will be read by other people.
Okay, if you win the Nobel Prize for Literature, you make your living writing about yourself, yeah, no need to feel shame. And if you're an ordinary bloke who's going to blow up his life publishing things like this, then yeah, you probably should feel shame.
A moment which I feel will never come. By then I could have had an accident or died. A war or a revolution could have broken out. This delay makes it possible for me to write today, in the same way I used to lie in the scorching sun for a whole day at 16, or make love without contraceptives at 20, without thinking about the consequences.
Yeah. So usually it's a really good idea to think about the consequences, but when it comes to writing, sometimes you need to forget them for a while, at least during early drafts.
Ernaux sometimes ends her books with the dates of their composition.
Oh, how lovely, sublime.
Inspired applause. But Happening, when it was published, got a tepid response.
Right, so this is her novel about getting an abortion, right? Her lightly autobiographical novel about getting an abortion is why she won the Nobel Prize for Literature this year.
But she can focus only on her own female reality. In a strange way, my inability to write my thesis was far more alarming than my need to abort, Ernaux writes. I had stopped being an intellectual. I don't know whether this...
Well, guess what? When you have a toothache, you stop being an intellectual. And if you break your leg, you'll stop being an intellectual. If you have severe constipation, you'll stop being an intellectual. If you're on the path to having an orgasm, you'll stop being an intellectual. If you get exhausted working out, you'll stop being an intellectual. If you're shopping for food, you'll stop being an intellectual.
Feeling is widespread. It causes indescribable pain. A different kind of pain follows a failed attempt to solve her problem with a pair of knitting needles. All the while, she feels time flowing inside and outside of me, the common calendar moving forward, her private one moving back. It has been speculated, fairly, that Ernaux's writing on abortion may be why the Nobel jury saw fit to award the prize to her this year, less than 4 months after Roe v. Wade was overturned.
So remember when Barack Obama, about 2 months into office, won the Nobel Peace Prize? Like, he hadn't done anything, but because the Nobel Prize Committee so loathed George W. Bush, they gave Barack Obama a Nobel Peace Prize, even though he hadn't done anything. They give this Sheila, a Nobel Prize for Literature, primarily because she wrote about abortion.
During her October visit to Barnard, Ernaux was asked, almost as if she were a politician, if she wished to say something to American women. She found it extraordinary, she replied, that the US, which had legalized abortion before France, should return to savagery.
So, get what's savage? Savage isn't extinguishing life. Right. Savagery isn't killing babies. Savagery isn't murdering fetuses. Right? Savagery is not making it the law of the land that it's absolutely legal to carry out this killing. That's savagery from her perspective.
This remark inspired applause, but Happening, when it was published, got a tepid response. It was a book that bothered people, Ernaux told me. Aside from the events themselves, rendered with almost unbearably claustrophobic exactitude, the abortion and what happens afterward is so brutal that even the film adaptation seems gentle by comparison. There is Ernaux's total lack of guilt about what she did.
Well, why did any Ernaux feel no guilt about having an abortion? Because there is not a widespread, powerful movement in France to call abortion murder. Women in Australia don't feel guilt after having an abortion. Many women in America do because it's socially constructed. That's what we feel guilty about, is socially constructed. Societies that try to instill guilt upon having an abortion, all right, they are frequently successful. In societies that don't have hot button culture issues such as abortion, right, and widespread movements to declare abortion murder, right, you're going to be much less likely to have women feel guilty about having an abortion. Guilt is socially constructed.
There may be no parade, but for years she celebrated the night of the procedure as an anniversary.
Wow, now that's pretty cold.
For the past few years,
she celebrates the anniversary of having an abortion. Wow. Ugh. She celebrates it. She celebrates her extinguishing a life that was growing within her. What a lady.
Ernaux told me, she has had the sense that she has fulfilled a certain trajectory. No, not a trajectory, a destiny. She laughed.
Yeah, she fulfilled her destiny by having sex without paying any attention to birth control, being absolutely careless, and then killing the growing life inside her. What a destiny. Powerful stuff.
But she meant it. Not a destiny that was written from the beginning, one that was constructed bit by bit, of course. One big reason for that is A Girl's Story, which Ernaux published in 2016. The book deals with the summer of 1958, when Ernaux, nearly 18, left home on her own for the first time to work as a counselor at a summer camp. On her third night there, she is selected by the 22-year-old head counselor for a tryst, though to put that word to their encounter would be to imply romance, or at least enjoyment. Annie is a protected only child of extreme social naivete, a girl who does not know how to make a telephone call, has never taken a shower or bath.
Doesn't know how to make a telephone call, has never taken a shower or bath. How did she bathe? In a tub? Like, went for a swim in the lake? So she's so naive, she bears absolutely no responsibility for this tryst happening. There's nothing she did. Right? She played zero role in this happening. Right? Abortions, life, lovers, divorces, all these things just happen to her. She's just passive receptacle.
Who feels herself free and on the verge of life, ready to escape home, have adventures, fall in love. Now she is laid down on a strange man's bed and watches as her body is used for his pleasure.
So this is a great time for you to share in the chat how people have used your body for pleasure. Now think about what Uncle Wally did to you when you were just a wee lad and couldn't resist because you're experiencing so much pleasure at the time.
But the experience is neither one of horror nor shame, only an obedience to what was happening. Far from seeing herself as a victim, she becomes slavishly devoted to the fact of her submission before this indifferent master.
Yeah, so this is a great time for you to talk about the slavishness, the slavish nature of your submission to, dominant masters, right? This is a safe space for you to share.
That searing episode forms the kernel of the book. Around it, Ernaux builds a kind of detective story. The Annie from 1958 is a missing person. No photographs of her from that summer exist. The diaries she kept were burned by her mother. But Ernaux knows that the girl is still alive. She has been living inside her for decades. She is at the root of everything Ernaux has become as a woman and as a writer. And now she must be faced on her own terms. There seems something liberating in this, but Ernaux disagreed. I never considered writing to be a form of liberation.
So when you write in the chat, do you find that a form of liberation, right? Do you find it a way of reaching up or reaching down?
He said, the image that I have is always of descending, of deepening something.
So is that your experience of writing in the chat, that you're traveling down and descending and reaching for something?
And there isn't much freedom down there, not really. Often, when I speak with other writers, with female writers, really, the image we have of writing really varies. Some of them say that for them, it's a way of going up towards something.
So when you write in the chat, do you experience that as an explosion of freedom, akin to an orgasm? Feel free to share.
But for me, it's the absolute opposite. Not going underground exactly, but into a well. What draws her down? An idea of some kind? No, an obsession. The image of the well brings to mind a rescue mission. Ernaux, so devoted to chronicling what she calls the stupefaction of the real, has a mystical side too.
All right, so do you write in the chat because you feel compelled to chronicle the stupefaction of the real? I can understand why that might drive you.
It seems to me that I have finally freed the girl of 58, broken the spell that kept her prisoner for over 50 years.
Thank God.
Ernaux writes of her younger self. This is triumphant, magical.
Amazing.
It would make a wonderful ending.
Wonderful.
But it is not the end of the book, only its halfway point.
Amazing.
All endings in Ernaux's world are temporary.
Incredible.
The meaning of what she describes keeps shifting as time does.
Prescient.
Critics will be tempted to refer to Ernaux's output, this 50-year spelunking of the self, as an oeuvre.
An
But
oeuvre.
she hates that word.
An oeuvre.
An oeuvre is something that's
Oeuvre.
closed, she told me.
Oeuvre.
And mine will be closed when I'm dead.
Wow. So please consider collecting your most prescient chat posts and collate them into an oeuvre. Society would be better for it. God bless.